Welcome back to the Frontier Culture Museum on our 4th of July celebrations. We're here at our 1820s farm to show you how to bake a apple pie in the historic manner. So a little bit of the history of apple pies. Apple pie is actually not technically American. The earliest reference you can find in a cookbook is actually dated to a 14th century English cookbook. And apples themselves are not native to the Americas. They were brought over by the early colonists. So the whole pie idea and the apple itself was actually brought over with most of the English colonists, which is why you don't see any reference to actually eating the pie in America until 1697 in a diary entry. Now, most colonists would bake in a seasonal manner. That means they would follow the produce that is available in each season. Apples are usually harvested in late summer or fall, but in this case, the Dutch actually prepared a method of preservation that involved paring and coring and drying the apple, so apple pies could be actually produced all year round. Now, our receipt today actually requires the use of fresh apples, so that's what we're using today, thanks to the modern methods of refrigeration. So, we are going to go ahead and show you how we actually prepare a pie in this manner.
Today we're going to be using The Art of Cookery by Hannah Glasse. Now, Hannah first published this book in 1747, and there were many editions that followed all the way up into the 19th century. Mrs. Glasse's purpose was simply to educate the uneducated as well as the lower class. Now, the thing is about Mrs. Glasse's recipes is that they're very simplistic, and she doesn't add any measuring units in. And it's because she's expecting the baker to use the technique of trial and error. Now, our apple pie recipe is going to be a tad bit fancier than maybe you may see in some other recipe books, including the Virginia Housewife published in 1827. Our apple pie recipe is going to be using a great deal of lemon juice and sugar to bring out the apple flavor. We're going to begin with a puff pastry, which is just simply water, flour, and butter mixed together. The more butter that you have, the flakier your crust will be. Mrs. Glasse also suggests to add in a little bit of apples, pared and quartered. She also suggests some lemon peel, a little bit of lemon juice, some cloves, and sugar. To add a little bit of extra sweetness, she suggests making an apple pie syrup, which can include some water, a blade of mace, and then you strain and boil it till the syrup is very good, she says.
That's where the lack of specificity comes in. What does very good mean when you are actually boiling apples? Basically, it means that it has become aromatic and that the apples themselves have gotten a little mushy, so that way you are ready to make your syrup by boiling it with the sugar. But we are ready to prepare our pie. So the first thing we're going to do is take our apples and layer them out onto the pie, pre-prepared pie crust. And actually that term crust was first used in the American Revolution. Before that it was called a coffin pastry, which was pretty much an inedible dough that actually acted as pretty much a preservation technique. You couldn't eat it, but it kept the flies out of it. But we are going to use what is called a crust. And then we're going to put a little bit of our lemon zest around. Just give it that nice bright flavor. And squeeze a little lemon on top. And just add some sugar. Just shake sugar to taste. So if you like a sweeter pie, it's going to be much more sugar. Of course, sugar would still be expensive, so using a lot of sugar would be somewhat wasteful on the frontier. But you want enough to make a nice syrup in there. And then we'll put some of our whole cloves over this. As the recipe says, every now and then have one. And then at the very last, we do our pre-prepared syrup. You don't need to use all of it, just enough to wet the sugar. finish rolling your top. And for your last step, before you're ready to bake, you just want to crimp the pie shell together. Pulling off any extra. And cut some slits for the steam to escape. Make it nice and pretty. There's our prepared pie. It's now ready to go in the oven. So let's take you over to our oven. This is our outdoor bake oven. This is a falling temperature oven. So what we have is a fire that is on our bake surface right now. We're going to go ahead and scrape the ashes out and actually get ready to put the pie right on there. So as you can see, we've had the fire going for about 4 hours, which would be typical. You can only gauge temperature by the amount of wood that you're using and by actually sticking your hand inside the oven. And you just have to get used to it. Again, that's where the trial and error comes into. You have to know if it's a quick oven or a slow oven. That's all going to depend on the amount of wood and basically if you burn the hair off your arm or not. What we're going to do is scrape the ashes out, which is a very messy job. And now the pie is ready to go in. And we'll use the ash rake to push it back. So now our pie is ready to bake. So we'll shut the door, make sure the damper is closed, and that is ready to sit and bake. Now, having an outdoor oven is going to be very useful, something you might see commonly either in summer kitchen or on a farm such as this. This would be very traditional to be a communal oven, something we talk about on our German farm. You would see this quite often throughout Europe. If you have an outdoor bake oven, it is actually going to take the heat away from the house and keep the heat of that fire, that 4-hour fire, from heating up the kitchen on a very hot day like today. That's pretty much a good idea. Now this, however, that is going to probably sit, I think that's pretty much a quick oven, so it might actually be done anywhere from 20 to probably about an hour. It's going to depend on just a lot of trial and error and checking to see if that crust is brown or not. That's really the only way, other than smell, that you can tell if that pie is done. And that's why a lot of modern recipes still say, even when they give you a time to bake, they still say, check to see if the top is browned or not. Now let's do a little bit of the history of the phrase, American is apple pie. Most of you have probably either heard that phrase, maybe even used that phrase. It's actually not as historic as you might think. That phrase actually came about in the early 20th century. I think 1902, the New York Times was the first to proclaim that pie itself was the American synonym of prosperity. So that ties back into what we were talking about earlier with the Declaration of Independence, the search for prosperity, the search for happiness. That is tying into the ability to eat apple pie. It's was somewhat of a luxury still even early in the turn of the century. Now, going into the 1920s, that's where the phrase actually starts picking up speed. You start seeing it more commonly referred to in newspapers, either in the literal sense where they are saying something like immigration or baseball is actually as American as apple pie, or in the more tongue-in-cheek sense, talking about the history of the American social issues, such as I've seen newspapers that say American is apple pie, referring to things like corruption or lynchings or poverty.
The phrase officially takes off in World War II when soldiers are away from home and they're feeling a little homesick. So American propaganda system begins to set the phrase American pie, or feeling like you need a little bit of your mom and apple pie. Now, eventually what happens in a lot of foreign countries is that they start baking donuts and apple pie in order to make the soldiers feel a little bit at home. They still do this today.
All right, so we're going to let our pie sit here, but we do have one to show you that's finished. Would you like to grab it? Sure. We're doing a little bit of culinary magic, and we did have a pre-prepared one. So as I said, the only way you really know the pie is done is if the cover is brown. So here is our lovely, already finished apple pie. Very simple, very tasty, and should be very good to eat. All right, let's go ahead and turn over to any questions we might have.
How does Johnny Appleseed tie into the American Pie story?
It's actually a very good one. So Johnny Appleseed himself was actually a real person. His name was Johnny Chapman. However, Johnny Appleseed, the myth of walking around whistling, wearing a pot on his head, scattering apple seeds, was probably not quite the real truth. Right, so actually Johnny Appleseed himself, Johnny Chapman, was more concerned with the propagation of crab apples and apples for cider, because he was actually very concerned with making cider in the new frontier.
Why is it American as apple pie if the fruit and recipe aren't American?
That's actually a good question too, because in this case, as we said, it is coming from the immigrants that are coming over, the early colonists. So the colonists are actually bringing something from home, and that is being propagated. It's going to be made more in America, and it just becomes synonymous, as Michaela was saying, because it's a tasty dessert. It's very simple to make, especially once you get the preservation. You can make it all year round. It's just something that the Americans really took off. You do see apple pie around the world. Pretty much everywhere you've got apples and you have some sort of pie pastry, you're going to be making apple pie. But we are a story of immigrants, and that is, especially food ways, is one of the major ways that people make connections.
What variety of apples were the most common?
That's actually a very difficult one. Apples themselves, we don't have a whole lot of the historic apples left. There is actually a preservation effort right now